They thought it was crazy. They thought I was out of my mind. They didn't believe people would watch an untranslated visual novel channel. They said it was a terrible idea. Unfortunately for them, I'm not good at making sensible decisions. Thank you. It is my great pleasure to welcome all 570,000 of you to the first edition of the Meirin's Visual Novel Awards. Here with me, I have a list compiling every VN I played this year and rank them in order to find the best of the best. But before we start, let's lay out the overall criteria for this tier list. First of all, it will primarily consist of visual novels that I played this year. However, since I tend to play a lot of weird, obscure stuff, I've decided to also include VNs I played in the past that received an official Western release in 2024. Finally, the titles will be presented in the order I completed them, except for the final one, which will be my pick for the best visual novel I played this year. And if you have any complaints, just remember that I don't make the rules here. Wait, I actually do? Well, never mind that. Either way, let's just get things rolling.
Kanojo-tachi no Ryuugi.
This is one of the first visual novels I finished this year, but also one that left me slightly disappointed. I don't think it's a bad game or anything, but to me it slightly lacked a better sense of direction. I was quite on board during the first or so hours, since it kind of felt like a Tsukihime knockoff, in a good way. But then the story shifted its focus to the main cast working on some stage play, which completely lost me. I must admit that, just in general, I'm simply not a fan of this sort of narrative, since I feel like most VNs that have this premise follow the same predictable patterns. There is, however, one route that I thought was quite good, since it kind of reminded me of something Skaji would write, and the epilogue was fun enough. But as a whole, I'm slightly mixed on this one. C tier.
Memories of Fille for Dearest.
This is one title I have not much to say about, mostly because it's basically just a regular fan disc, for better or worse. I did technically enjoy it, since I think Innocent Fille is a pretty good entry in the Memof series, and one of the scenarios managed to deliver on the psychological tension the original game excelled at. Also, kind of unrelated, but it looks like Mages will release a second Memories of Historia collection, but this time with the fan discs. Pretty neat. Anyway, for Dearest goes into the B tier.
Paranormasight File23 Honjo 7 不思議.
Ah yes, Paranormasight, the Google Street View-inspired visual novel. Anyway, this title certainly had a very strong start with its moody and dark atmosphere, but it then moved away from that and became a more or less standard detective story with a paranormal twist to it. I still thought it was enjoyable, but I couldn't shake a slight sense of disappointment due to how much it nailed that initial horror vibe. Regardless, the unique and diverse cast alongside its snappy presentation made this game a pretty fun time. B tier.
5分後に意外な結末モノクロームの図書館.
Gofungo ni Igai na Katsumatsu, on the other hand, was slightly underwhelming. It's not like I had the biggest hopes for it, but I thought its premise had a lot of potential that the game didn't quite fulfill. Basically, it's an anthology type of visual novel where, after finishing each story, you categorize them based on the feelings they evoked in you. The stories themselves are, as the title indicates, only 5 minutes short with some sort of plot twist in them. The problem is that, due to their brevity, it was nearly impossible to get invested in them. The game's overall meta-story was also rather weak. Still, the stories were decent enough on their own, but nothing special either. C tier.
Tsuyokiss Sangaki.
Tsuyokiss Sangaki ended up being one of the biggest surprises I had with a VN this year. I remember struggling to fully enjoy the original back when I played it, since I felt like the pacing was all over the place, and some characters were really hard to connect with, like Connie, especially Connie. But for some reason, Sangaki fixed most of the issues I had, or at least I think it did. I kind of wonder if I simply wasn't in the mood to play Tsuyokiss at the moment I did. But regardless, Sangaki, to me, truly delivered on the comedy, taking full advantage of the dynamics of the group. I guess one clear advantage over the first game is that all of those relationships were already established. So right from the get-go, the game would bombard you with familiar gags and recurring jokes. Obviously, it's not like the game wasn't without its flaws, as the story occasionally dragged during some parts. But even so, the game managed to make me consider replaying the first one, which I think is a pretty solid achievement in and of itself. It's an A tier.
Tsuyokiss Next.
Naturally, after enjoying Sangaki that much, the next obvious step was for me to check out its follow-up, the aptly named Tsuyokiss Next. However, I found this one to be a bit of a dud. The main aim of this entry was to introduce the next generation of characters, but that inevitably led to comparisons with the original, and it's here that the game seriously fell short. Even with its flaws, Tsuyokiss has always stood out for its exceptional cast. So much so that whenever I hear one of their VAs in another game, I immediately think, oh, that's that character from Tsuyokiss. Next cast, on the other hand, just felt bland and uninteresting. I will admit that, by the end of the game, I grew fond of a couple of these new characters, but others never stepped away from the generic zone. And just in general, the game felt kind of bloated and not that interesting. C tier.
Tsuyokiss Festival.
After finishing Next, I was too deep into the Tsuyokiss rabbit hole, so I decided to close it up with Festival, which, going by its VNDB ratings, was supposedly the best entry in the series. Spoiler alert, it wasn't, but at least it was certainly better than Next. This title was meant to be a celebration of the whole franchise, being a crossover between the two generations. For that reason alone, it was above Next, since you also got the original cast alongside the slightly weaker newer one. The game basically has two main routes and then slightly shorter scenarios for all the other returning heroines. Those two main routes were decent enough. I thought Kitsune's scenario was quite good, mostly due to how unique she was. Joe's route was just okay. To be honest, I still consider Sangaki to be vastly superior, but Festival also had its moments. B tier.
Kanon.
I'm sure Kanon getting an official English translation wasn't on anyone's bingo card, but hey, it's great that it finally happened. The game itself admittedly has its own quirks, typical of early-era Nakig, such as using slightly contrived plot devices to direct the narratives in ways that feel a bit too convenient, but damn if the game isn't full of charm. It's one of those VNs that simply feels good to read, with quippy dialogue and a fantastic winter-themed atmosphere. Just the other day I booted it up since I wanted to check if the translation was decent enough, and I really had to force myself to stop reading it. Sure, it might not have those incredibly memorable moments like Clannad or Little Busters did, but I still think it's a very, very enjoyable read. A solid B tier.
Tsukihime A Piece of Blue Brass Moon.
You know, if someone were to ask me which visual novel I would recommend to an absolute beginner, I think I would go with Tsukihime Remake. I'm aware it's not exactly a short VN, but what makes this game so easy to recommend is how it mixes plenty of genres, but does so with extreme grace. This is a visual novel that blends action, horror, mystery, and romance. But despite juggling so many genres, none of them feel overshadowed or underdeveloped. I'm going to make a pretty weird comparison, but Tsukihime kind of reminds me of the original Doom, not because of its historic relevance or anything like that, but rather because both games managed to find one formula that worked amazingly well, be it Demons on Mars or a vampire action thriller with high school romance. Thankfully, this remake lived up to the hype, with its absolutely jaw-dropping visual presentation and a completely new and better developed take on Ciel's route. Truly, its second part cannot come anytime soon. To be honest, I always thought the far side routes of the original game to be far more interesting than the near side routes. So if the other side of Red Garden manages to match this level of quality and improvement, I believe the combination of the two might become one of, if not the, best visual novels of all time. An easy S tier.
Iwakura Aria.
We have now reached the first, well, technically the second visual novel I reviewed on the channel. Iwakura Aria was a pleasant surprise for me. I didn't go in with the higher of expectations, but it turned out to be a pretty well put together, character-focused visual novel. I know this game has just been announced for an official English release in 2025, and for those of you hoping it will be a mystery-focused Yori VN, I'd suggest tempering your expectations just a bit. This game is first and foremost a story about the main girl, Aria. Everything else serves to reveal new facets of her character and add personal depth. I do think the game succeeds at making her compelling enough to keep the readers engaged, but you might be disappointed if you're expecting a complex, overarching mystery. The ending itself was also slightly underwhelming, but there's one revelation afterwards which subtly added a whole new layer of symbolism that stuck with me. I think this one should go into the B tier. Flutter of Birds is the type of visual novel that shows its age in more ways than one. It's kind of amusing that it feels more dated than canon, despite having been released 2 years after it. Still, maybe it's because I'm a sucker for VNs of this era, especially the Nakige kind, but I found it to be quite enjoyable. Overall, I would say its strongest point was how honest and earnest it felt. I think there's a very delicate balance in Nakige visual novels where they need to present an emotional drama that resonates with readers without feeling melodramatic or forced. Otherwise, it can become overly cruel or downright comedic, leading to an emotional disconnect. Flutter of Birds, with its medical themes, makes it clear that all the girls are suffering from some illness, leaving it up to you whether or not to become invested in them. I also like that their personalities were depicted in a very human way, instead of heavily relying on common tropes. Admittedly, the game can be a bit annoying with its systems, and it's a pain in the butt to get running, but I think it's worth checking out if you are into old-school VNs. It goes into the B tier. Yamibo is a fascinating VN with some unfortunately big oversights. The premise is extremely unique, both narratively and structurally speaking. I was particularly drawn to the concept of the protagonist and his companions visiting different worlds, each with its own story and setting, which eventually converge into a single cohesive narrative. Lilith, one of the main heroines, was one of the funniest and most charismatic characters I've seen in a VN this year. Also, making the protagonist a talking hat is just genius. However, the total lack of music deeply hurts the immersion factor, which is a shame since the world, or I guess I should say worlds, they created were totally absorbing. At the very least, it left me intrigued about its developer, Root, and their other works. Apparently, in 2025, they are releasing a remake of one of their games, Kao no Naitsuki. I'm honestly quite looking forward to it. I hope they don't screw it up. At any rate, I think Yamibo deserves to be in the B tier. If Kanon getting an official English release wasn't crazy enough, this year also blessed us with Fate Stay Night, receiving a localized remaster. Now, I haven't played this remaster myself, but I played the original game many eons ago. To be honest, I don't know if I were to play it now, I would have the same opinions or not as I did back then, especially since now I can read it in its original language. Basically, my thoughts on it pretty much echoed what most people would tell you about it. The Fate route was decent but pales in comparison with the other two. Unlimited Blade Works was probably the most fun, while Heaven's Feel has the strongest revelations. I think it's impressive how Nasu is capable of creating premises that are this immediately captivating. Easily an A-tier visual novel.
Kanata Made.
Before talking about the next one, I need to ask you one question. Do you enjoy suffering? Because if you do, oh boy, do I have the VN for you. Okay, jokes aside, Konata is not really the type of visual novel you read to unwind and relax. I mean, the protagonist has terminal cancer, which pretty much says it all, but that's exactly what makes it so compelling. He would often have inner monologues where he reflected on his own mortality, and seeing his views regarding life and death influencing and changing his course of action through the story was deeply thought-provoking. There were some narrative aspects that were kind of underdeveloped, especially the whole supernatural side of the story, but I personally still hold it in high regard. Let's put it in the A tier. Moving to the complete opposite side of the spectrum, Yugeki Keiken Pat Vessel was a loud, silly, and bombastic comedy-focused visual novel. I get the feeling VNs like this get harshly criticized for not being intellectually nuanced. Luckily for this game, I'm a bit of a connoisseur of dumbass VNs. Yugeki, you know what? This title is too long. Let's just call it Yugakan. As I was saying, Yugakan ended up being a refreshingly funny visual novel that, for some reason, also included one route with a pretty good story to boot. I really liked its carefree attitude, as well as its recurring gags. I did, however, feel like some characters lacked a bit of charm, especially the main girl, but I think I can still recommend Yugakan to people looking for a comedy VN. B tier.
ホワイトクラリティ
White Clarity, on the other hand, is a title I unfortunately can't recommend. While it boasts an impressive presentation with an almost cinematic style, it ultimately falls short where it matters most: the story, and especially the characters. I think it had its heart in the right place, trying to create a narrative that focused on the segregation issues some individuals faced during the pre-modern era. However, none of its characters were especially likable, and it even had some plot consistency issues, not to mention some events that didn't make that much sense. A generally underwhelming title, all things considered. D tier.
エヴァーメイデン堕落の縁の乙女たち
Do you want to hear a funny story? I heard that ElevenLabs was going to get a 2024 official English release, so I thought, why not write a review for it and for once make a video useful to English readers? Well, I guess the localizer company had different plans, or maybe no plans at all, since at the time of making this video, their Twitter account has gone silent for an entire year. Are you still alive, guys? Anyways, ElevenLabs is really good, probably one of Lycoris's best titles. The mystery was nicely set up, the cast was very likable, and the story featured some truly cool and clever ideas. While the pacing may slightly falter in some parts, the great world building and subtle foreshadowing more than make up for it, making those issues easy to ignore. This one goes into the A tier.
シルエット
Silhouette is the type of visual novel that demands a lot of patience from its reader. The first hours are honestly quite dull and generic, and the lack of voice acting doesn't help either. However, once those initial hours are over, the game throws at you one truly memorable twist that recontextualizes the story in a really interesting way. Besides that, some of the individual routes were quite enjoyable on their own. I think the developer, CDPA, deserves a bit more attention, even if they only ever released 3 titles. They had a very unique style that I don't think you can find anywhere else. As for Silhouette, I put it into the B tier.
もしも明日が晴れならば
Despite its age, Moshimo Ashitagahara Naraba was one of the most premium-feeling visual novels I played this year. This is one title whose first hours were simply amazing, possibly one of the best introductory chapters from any VN. Unfortunately, it struggled to maintain that level of quality afterwards, but it still had its moments. I think this game's biggest flaw was how it tended to gravitate towards a generic mood when it proved that it could have been so much more. It's still a fairly good visual novel, and it has one girl that speaks with Kansai dialect, so it gets extra points on my behalf. B tier.
みかん
On the other hand, Mikan was one of the least premium-feeling visual novels I played this year. Okay, I'm not going to bully this VN too much. It's quite old, and I actually like it a fair bit. This title was actually Shuman Yu's first foray into the visual novel medium, and it's kind of amusing to see how obvious the parts he wrote are, which in turn means that the parts he didn't write were slightly weak. The game is basically an anthology of 3 stories with an overarching meta-narrative unifying them. While I feel it could have explored the connections between the tales more deeply, there are still some nice touches throughout. That being said, the atmosphere was very well achieved. Manor settings really shine when it comes to horror. I just kind of wish the quality of the stories was a bit more even. B tier.
すみれ
Sumire is kind of a clumsy VN, but one whose heart was in the right place. I found the depiction of the characters' struggles to be very convincing, while also quite relatable. I think it's the type of visual novel that understands its public and creates a narrative that aims to resonate with their emotions. I would say it mostly achieves that goal, but as the story progresses, it tries to take a more ambitious approach. which I don't think was too gracefully handled. Nevertheless, I can see this striking an emotional chord for many. Once again, B tier.
消えた世界と月と少女
Eta Toto, yes, that's the official abbreviation, is a very interesting visual novel that's simultaneously kind of a mess. It's a mystery-focused story, but the quality of the foreshadowing was all over the place. Some parts were ridiculously obvious, while others were actually quite clever. It's also a VN that kind of requires you to occasionally suspend your disbelief, but the ride can be fun on its own. On the other hand, the romance felt very tacked on, with rushed arcs that didn't convey their bonds that well. To give you an idea, I think this is the first airage I've seen with an option to automatically skip all H scenes. But if you don't care that much for those, the actual story is quite entertaining. And it even gives some Higurashi vibes here and there. Let's put it in the B tier.
シンスメモリーズ星空の下で
Okay, since memories, where do I even start? I have already mentioned on this channel that it is one of the most disappointing visual novels I've played. While I only discovered the Memories Off series through the Historia collection, that release was more than enough to make me fall in love with its atmosphere, its setting, and its characters. Unfortunately, since Memories just didn't manage to capture the same highs, for me at least, the cast wasn't particularly likable, the mystery felt bland and uninspired, and the protagonist was just kind of there. That said, upon revisiting it, I did grow to appreciate some of what it was trying to do, but I still wouldn't rate it very highly within the series. Also, judging by the low influx of new votes on VNDB after its Western release, I think it's fair to say this game kind of flopped. It makes me wonder if the series has any future in the West. I mean, I hope it does, but if this one truly sold poorly, I doubt Mages has any motivation left to translate the older entries. We will see, I guess. As for Shin Memo, it's going into the D tier, just above White Clarity.
エンジェルブレッド
Angel Bullet is a pretty cool VN with lots of interesting ideas. It takes a Wild West setting and completely turns it upside down, mixing it with folklore and gothic horror elements. What's interesting is that, despite being a Japanese-only visual novel, the amount of research that went into making the setting believable is quite commendable. I also enjoyed the gradual change of tone, from a purely comedic story to something far more serious and even quite dark at times. Its main drawback, however, is that it's only partially voiced. To be honest, I personally don't mind it that much if a VN doesn't have voice acting. The issue with Angel Bullet is that the voice acting that it has is absolutely fantastic, so it feels kind of a tease to only give it to you in such small amounts. Still, the sheer originality and creativity on display makes it an A-tier visual novel for me.
リコリスラディアッタ
I'm not going to lie, Lycoris Radiata is kind of a guilty pleasure of mine. You could argue that it's a game whose story isn't ambitious nor memorable, to which I would reply by putting my hands on my ears and completely ignoring those perfectly valid complaints. But really, this is one game whose main goal was to make the admittedly small cast likable, and in that regard, I think it remarkably succeeds. I also appreciated how it doesn't overstay its welcome at all. The main issue is how it doesn't really try to go beyond the formulaic gouge template. But when it pulls it off so well, I can't bring myself to be too upset. Also, the art was lovely, and so was Suzuri. It's going into the B tier.
最果ての今
Reading Saihate no Ima was certainly an experience. It's by far one of the most thought-provoking visual novels out there, with plenty of complex topics that delve into the psychology of the human being and the inner workings of society. But what's amazing about Saihate no Ima is that these concepts aren't there just for show or for the author to boost his own ego. Rather, they are used thematically to contextualize the identities of the characters and their interpersonal dynamics. It also helps that this is one of the most memorable but also funniest casts I've seen in a VN. The only main caveat is the absurd amount of info dumping the game can ruthlessly throw at you. It can be quite overwhelming at times and make some parts more obtuse, making the already complex narrative even harder. But if you can deal with that, then this title is a must-read, in my opinion. However, in my review, I mentioned how it doesn't feel right to directly compare Saihate no Ima to other VNs due to its uniqueness, and I still stand by that. But I guess that means that I will need to make a slight adjustment to the tier list. All right, now we can rank it. Asterism is a visual novel with a handful of decent ideas scattered across a massive slop of utterly generic content. The story is divided into 3 chapters. The first focuses on presenting the main girl to make you care about her, while the latter 2 are where the story truly kicks into gear. The issue is that the first chapter feels like the game is just ticking boxes, running through the most cliché scenes you'd expect in a gouge. This is all to build up to a plot twist, but I feel like anyone paying even the slightest attention would see it coming from a mile away, which makes those early hours even more excruciating, as you're essentially just waiting for the game to finally get going. Once it does, the game admittedly improves, but by that point I simply didn't care enough about the characters and whatever struggles they had to face. This one goes into the C tier. Okay, so while Tsui no Stella officially released in English last year, it did technically get its Switch English port this year, so it also gets to be included. Hey, it's my video. I'm the one who gets to bend the rules. Anyway, Tsui no Stella is most definitely one of Key's strongest titles. It's well-paced, the themes it deals with feel relevant, and the world building, despite its short runtime, is remarkably well-crafted. Probably what I enjoyed the most is how both main characters contributed to each other's personal growth. That said, even though Tanaka Rome wrote this, I did miss some of the unhinged writing he displayed in titles like Rewrite and especially Saihate no Ima. Hopefully, Key keeps collaborating with him while also giving him full creative control. At any rate, Tsui no Stella is still, if I may, a stellar visual novel. It goes into the A tier.
Symphonic Rain.
You might also be wondering what the hell Symphonic Rain is doing here, since its official PC English release came out many years ago. Well, turns out this month the Switch port finally received its English patch, so I thought, why not include it as well? Anyway, this is another VN that I played some time ago, but I do remember liking some aspects of it, such as the atmosphere and a couple of its story twists. I also found the music conservatory setting to be unique while also realistically depicted, which is not an easy thing to achieve. At the same time, this is one title with particularly slow pacing, so you kind of need to be in the mood for it if you want to enjoy it to the fullest. The music was amazing though. I'm thinking B tier. Chanter was one of the most pleasant surprises I had this year. I believe it was this past autumn during a Fanza sale that I bought a collection of 14 Terios-developed visual novels for only 1,500 yen. In retrospect, that deal was kind of amazing. So far, I've only played Lycoris and Chanter, and both were a couple of gems. However, between the two, I have to go with Chanter as the better one. I will admit some parts of it were slightly underdeveloped, but the main twist was brilliant. I think it's indeed praiseworthy whenever a slice-of-life focused VN manages to greatly subvert the reader's expectations like Chanter did. In a sense, with fantasy or science fiction titles, the writers usually have a vast array of possibilities at their disposal from which they can pull out ideas to create such curveballs. That said, managing to get the same results within the limitations of day-to-day life is quite the achievement. For that reason, Chanter goes into the A tier. We have now finally reached the last visual novel I finished this year, Tsuyokiss. This is one that kind of disappointed me, although I think it had some great ideas. I found the connection between its themes and its narrative approach to be very fresh and refined. It's just that all the details surrounding that, such as the characters or their growth, were rather forgettable. I won't deny that the subpar state of its remaster might have influenced my views on this game. You would be surprised by how much of a difference good production values can enhance the overall experience. At any rate, I still think the visual novel is pretty good, just not amazing. B tier. And with those out of the way, it's finally time to reveal this year's winner of the Meirin's Visual Novel Awards. Drumroll, please. Wait, now that I think about it, I need to get my guitar for this one. Just let me check one thing real quick. Okay, I think I'm ready. And the winner is...
White Album 2.
Sure, call me basic, but damn, White Album 2 is great. I can't honestly think of any other VN that matches the depth of its depiction of romantic relationships. It's really impressive how it manages to capture the feeling of love and present it almost like yet another member of the cast, albeit an invisible, yet painfully thorny one. Obviously, the three main characters deserve all the praise they often receive. I know some can't stand Haruki for his behavior. Truth be told, he can be a pretty terrible person at times. But I felt his actions were fantastically contextualized thanks to the clear portrayal of his inner state of mind. However, my favorite character was without a doubt Setsuna. I think she was the one that went through the most interesting and complex character arc. Another aspect I deeply appreciated was how it turned bad endings into complete stories. In a sense, the entire game could be seen this way, but the Fugutai Teki no Kimi E chapter, in particular, was a clear highlight for me. Another standout aspect was how it turned an entire route into a huge homage to another Leaf title, one that I happen to really like. Really, I could be here praising the game all day, but for the sake of fairness, I guess if I had to whine about something, it would be how some parts of the closing chapter felt a bit slow. Probably inevitable considering the game's length, but I can't count the number of scenes where Haruki was simply staring at his room ceiling. Also, I kind of wished Coda featured characters from closing chapter more prominently. I understand that the story was about the main trio, but I really like those other characters too. Nevertheless, White Album 2 is by all metrics an absolute classic that leaves one hell of a lasting impact. It easily gets my seal of approval, if that counts for anything. And that wraps up the tier list. I should also mention that I've covered most of these on the channel, so if any of them caught your attention and you'd like to learn more, feel free to check out their video reviews. Or not, it's all up to you. I know that the list ended up consisting of mostly unknown stuff, but that's how I roll. That's not to say the year hasn't gone with some cool releases, although most of them have been limited to the English side of things. To be honest, I feel like it has been a rather quiet year on the Japanese front. Maybe the only title I find slightly interesting was Hooksoft's Secret Love Kari. Not because I particularly feel like playing it, but rather because I find the idea of a sleeveless uniform to be amusingly dumb. But anyway, I hope you found this video useful or entertaining. And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time. Meirin out.